shortly in a few minutes. Thank you all for joining us. We'll be getting started in about a minute or two, so bear with us. We're just letting folks get into the Zoom room, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, we're going to give it about 30 more seconds. All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on the side of the country that you are on. My name is Nada Sumik, and I'm the National Field Manager for We Are All America. And tonight's training is titled Power Mapping, Politics of Oppression and Legislative Process Workshop. So welcome, we're really glad to have you. And if we can go to the next slide, Andres. Thank you. So the goal of today's workshop is to engage, train, and equip local refugee and immigrant leaders in learning about power mapping and how it can be used to push refugee and immigrant legislation forward. So we really hope you find this workshop useful. And just a couple of housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, so we will send out the recording to you all afterward. Also, if you can please keep your audio on mute in case, just to avoid any static in the background. If you do have questions, feel free to raise your hand, and we will have also a Q&A session towards the end of the workshop. And also you can always ask in the chat box as well. And if we can go to the next slide. Now I'd like to introduce my wonderful speakers. We have tonight with us two amazing, wonderful women, Balkis, who is the Senior Policy Counsel in an International Refuge Assistance Project, and Paula Munoz, who's the Director of Campaign Organizing at Florida Immigrant Coalition. Do you ladies want to share any background about yourself before we continue?
Sure, I'll just quickly pipe in. As Naira mentioned, I'm a Senior Policy Counsel at IRAP. My portfolio covers our state and local policy advocacy. Prior to joining IRAP, I was at the New York City Council, and so I worked on a lot of consumer protection, human rights legislation. So that's a little bit my background. I'm also an immigrant myself, and my parents were refugees. On to you, Paula.
Hi, everyone. My name is Paula Munoz. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I'm, as mentioned, the Director of Campaigns for Campaign Organizing for the Florida Immigrant Coalition. I myself am I came as an asylum seeker at 7 years old from Colombia, and I have been advocating for immigrant rights for about 10 years in Florida, overseeing many campaigns, as you know, where it's a rough state to be in for refugees and immigrants. So just very excited to be here and share with you all, and also learn from you all.
Thank you both so much. And let's go ahead and continue on to the next slide. So just to give a little bit of background how our leadership development workshops such as this one came about, it started out through the We Are All America Opportunity for All table, and just a little background on our table. We Are All America Opportunity for All is a national leadership table that's housed out of We Are All America, which is a national campaign, and it's led by diverse refugees and immigrants. And really the idea behind the table, it's designed to ensure that we have representation and inclusivity of those of us with lived experience who come from refugee and immigrant backgrounds. And it's intended to really shift the narrative of refugees and immigrants that reflects their contributions and their lived experience. And so the Opportunity for All table has put together a series of workshops each month on different topics to help support leadership development among refugee and immigrant communities. So that's a little bit about OFA, and now I'll turn it over to Balkis to talk about IRAP.
Thanks, Neera. So IRAP is essentially a legal services organization. Our headquarters are here in New York City, but we have offices in Berlin, Amman, Jordan, and Beirut, Lebanon. We support refugees through the legal, advocating for refugees through the legal process, for example, family reunification, and we try to expand pathways both here in the US and Europe and other countries in terms of getting refugees and displaced people to safety. In the US, we advocate for federal and local legislation, primarily, improving existing pathways and advocating for new pathways. On to you, Paula.
Yeah, so the Florida Immigrant Coalition, we are a statewide coalition. We serve over 65 member organizations who whose mission match, our mission, which is to fight for all people, including immigrants in the state of Florida. We have many allies and partners and national partners as well. Here in Florida, we were founded in 1998 and officially were incorporated in 2004, and we've been working as a coalition to really build power in Florida for immigrant communities and refugees. And also, we work with different advocates, lawyers, and directly impacted people in order to really make an impact on policy that impacts our communities, and also power build as well.
We thought it would be fun to start with a little icebreaker if folks can put their name, city, and state, and why they're interested in state and local advocacy in the chat. Don't be shy. And maybe while folks are doing that, we can move on to the next slide. So the title of this workshop is The Politics of Oppression in the Legislative Process. And we thought we'd just start with some basics in terms of what is oppression. Oppression has two P's, and the two P's are essentially the inequality of power and privilege between groups of people, and that is oppression. I once heard someone describe oppression as a process of dehumanization of both, not just the oppressed, but the oppressor. And it's really important to kind of keep that in mind, that when you're less human when you don't have the same rights as everybody else. And that's really the key. And the oppressor themselves is also dehumanized when they treat others and don't see them as equals. And so that's kind of like the basic starting point of oppression. And when it comes to the law and the legal system and the legislative process, it's important to remember as we engage that, the legal system has a long history of being a tool of oppression. And so that's something to remember, that when you're working within the system, it's a system that traditionally and historically has been designed to maintain the status quo. And so it's when we fight for marginalized communities, it's a real uphill battle, because you are redistributing power and you are disturbing the status quo. And there are a lot of interests and there's a lot of power that lies within the status quo. So this is an often, a very long, a slow and fraught process that sometimes can take years, but it is still worth engaging, and our communities still have power, and we must engage and redistribute that power.
Yeah, and we can go into the next slide, which it kind of like, as we're talking about power, right? There's different powers that we need and that we have, right? So whether it's money or spending that we have, right? Like, unfortunately, we are under a system that requires, that makes money, very powerful when it comes to moving things around. And so There is power in money and spending. There's also power in media and stories, right? Like our voices. And I just wanted to point out that every single part of this graphic that you all see, which was lent to us by Firm Action, one of our partners, is that there is community power within all of these, right? Like our stories have power. The way we amplify them is through media. Values and morals, right? Like that is something that community builds. Numbers, we've seen when we come together and we create pressure and we come together as a community united, that those numbers have a lot of power. And also electoral power, right? For those that have the privilege to be able to vote, and for those that don't, right? Like we have power in the voices and the people that vote for us or that we vote for, right? So that's something that community can pull power from all of these areas, and that it also is used in order to move the policies and also the protections that we need for our communities. So with that, we are going to move into step one for power mapping, right? We're talking about power mapping, and it's something that, again, it may seem sometimes a little bit intimidating because of how, you know, a lot of communities and people are told that they don't have power. And so this is going to be, we're going to go over how we can organize to build that power and what it looks like step by step. So step one, in order to build out, whether it's a campaign or any type of power mapping, and to analyze, right? Because that's, power mapping is a tool for us to analyze, you know, what power there is and what we need to move. So you need to identify the goals and the partners, right? In order to do that, like what is it that you're fighting for and who's going to be part of it? So we can move to the next slide. All right, so identifying a clear ask. So it's important to do you know, research before engaging in any of legislative process. And as we know, legislative processes, whether it's local or statewide, I mean, federal is another you know, large monster that we're going to focus on local and state for this presentation, because it's, you know, it's attainable and it's within reach. You need to do your research in order to be able to identify what type of campaign or type of strategy you want to build. So identifying a clear ask, what is the issue that is being that is impacting the community, right? What is it that you're trying to solve? And what are the potential solutions, right? Like, you know, if there's something that is wrong, you know, there may be solutions that maybe seem very far away, but it's important to identify them to see if they will be able to work. And also like what your ask is. So identifying that clear ask that is based on something that's attainable and tangible, you know, as a solution, it's important. And then also identifying partners that could work with you, right? So it's very important to see who it is that it's impacted, right? Who are the impacted people that are a part of this? Who are people that can, you know, move work forward? Along with your research, it's important to figure out also what does research say about whatever issue you have, right? So for example, with something local like community IDs, which is an example we're going to keep using, there was a lot that we were finding out. It was a fight that was about a 10-year fight that required a lot of research, and it also like required for us to understand in the county where we started pushing it in, what is the field, right? Like what was the political field, and what was it that we were able to do? So when you're trying to identify a clear ask and also identify partners that could work with you, the questions you could ask is which industries, interests, organizations, agencies, governmental or other entities, what are they likely to be supportive of your ask or not? So this is really important because it's kind of identifying the who, right? Is support based upon direct economic interest or impact policy of our ideological grounds, right? So is it something that in your government, you know, whether it's local or city or county, does money move it more than the values or the morals, right? Like, is it something that the ideology fits, you know, the county you're trying to push or the city you're trying to push a change into? Does a coalition already exist, right? Sometimes we come up with ideas and we think there's a big problem and I want to find solutions for it, but is there work already that has been done around this, right? It's really important to figure this out, because then you're able to join either a coalition if it makes sense, to join it, and you're also able to see what type of work has been done already, so you're not replicating efforts that maybe have not worked, or maybe they have, and you build off of those. Also, who are you centering? This is something that is incredibly important and needs to be continuously asked when you are building, an advocacy campaign or a strategy. Are people that are directly impacted part of the conversations and the planning from the very beginning? Are you asking the questions around the problem and the solution to those folks, right? Is there that type of feedback being given? So investing time and resources to bring constituency to the table is important, and also managing expectations, because sometimes, if you're an organization or if you're a community leader, community will have expectations from you, and sometimes there may be not enough resources, or we don't want to promise something that we cannot provide to community. And so it's important to manage expectations both from community and also of yourself as well. And then generating, buying, and maintaining regular communication. We've seen it all before, especially during electoral cycles, that there'll be a lot of support for community trying to get people out to vote, and then they disappear, right? So whatever issue that you're trying to push, it's important to continue and maintain regular communication, even past small wins, during the road, because that is how you build power and trust with the community as well. And again, it's just important to keep the bottom, right? Like the who are you centering, keep throughout the whole process that we're gonna go over. That is something that needs to be consulted with constantly. Like the people need to be consulted with the strategy as we move forward. And we could move on to the next slide.
One more. Thank you, Andres. So one of the first stepping points, once you have a clear ask and you know exactly what you want, you've identified your partners, you've had those conversations, you've talked about your community, talked with your community, and you have buy-in, and you want to start advocating. You also want to figure out which, what type of government you're working with and where it makes sense for your advocacy. Is this an issue that can be addressed at the local level, or is this an issue that can be addressed at the state level? And as we mentioned at the beginning, we're focused at the state local level for this training, but there's also, immigration is a congressional issue primarily, but there are opportunities at the state and local level to succeed, and also kind of be the testing ground for a lot of interesting proposals that sometimes later become federal legislation. So it's a really exciting place to start advocacy. And the way you figure out, whether your issue is a state issue or a local issue is who's in asking your question, who's in charge of this issue. So for example, we're going to be workshopping community IDs at the end of our presentation. So who issues IDs? The state issues driver's licenses. Localities issue perhaps library cards. And so if getting driver's license issued to the undocumented is impossible politically, maybe it makes more sense to start at the local level. And it depends on the state. I mean, all politics is local, so you really have to figure out what your situation is within your state and city, and what is something that you could achieve. So do your research, figure out where you should start. At the state level, you have the Senate and the House in most states, other than Nebraska, which only has one legislature. There's the governor, who's the executive. He or she also has power to affect the solution that you want. And then there are agencies, depending on what it is. If you're doing healthcare advocacy and your ask is a small one, it might make more sense to go directly to the health agency that's responsible. I see a lot of folks working in health advocacy. That might be the best starting point for you. And And so you want to figure out, who has the power on your issue, and starting there. And so the second part of this is also asking what would make the most sense for your issue. So legislation, a lot of people start there thinking we need to change the law, but sometimes there are other ways to get the change that you want without changing the law, that are, more effective. So let's say you have a Senate and House that's hostile to immigration issues, but you have a friendly governor. Maybe the governor makes more sense to go to and get an executive order, which is basically a proclamation by the governor that has the force and effect of law. Let's say the governor is not friendly, the legislature isn't friendly, but the agencies are. A lot of them are run by civil servants, and they also have power. They can affect a rule. They can make a policy change that can still have a huge impact on your community. And so it's worth taking the time to figure out exactly, where you should go for your solution that would make sense. And part of, things that you want to ask when you pick, do I want legislation? Do I want executive order? Do I want a policy change? Is, we're going to be focusing on the legislative process. So in terms of legislation, if you want a long-term durable solution that's hard to change, that applies uniformly, legislation is probably your best bet. It's very hard to undo legislation once it's passed. It stays. It's very difficult to get rid of it. If you have a controversial ask, and you want to get it done quietly, you might want to go through rules or policy changes. But sometimes, the law says that you can only achieve your ask through legislation, and sometimes that's the only way to go. And so that's going to be our focus today, but I just wanted to highlight to folks that there are other ways that you can potentially achieve what you're hoping to do that don't necessarily require you to change the law. Next slide. And then next. So for identifying a legislative champion, and this applies mostly to bigger cities and states, the chair of the responsible committee is often a very good target. So what does that mean? So legislatures are broken off into different committees, finance committee, human rights committees, health committee, all these different committees, and they all have a chair. And the chair has a lot of power to decide, which bills are going to go to hearing. They can convince the members of the committee to vote for the bill. And so, those are often an ideal target as a legislative champion, but they're not the only ones. This has to be part of your strategy, figuring out who would be the right person that should champion the legislation or the solution or your ask that you want. I also want to mention, like, the speaker of the party, they're usually, what they want usually goes, but they're very difficult to get to sponsor legislation, especially if there's some controversy around it. Generally speaking, someone with a successful track record in your issue area is probably your best bet. They know who the players are, they have the experience, and they know who the players are, and they know who they have to convince, and they probably already have a lot of knowledge and idea of the legislator and who they can work with. And so, identifying that person is really important. And you want to ask questions like, does this person care about my issue? Is this person, somebody that will put in the time and work and will prioritize this? That's really important. So all of those things are factors that you want to consider when you approach a politician to take on your ask. And so in terms of, when you meet, once you figure out who you would like to have as a legislative champion, you might not get your first choice or second or third, but once you have some idea of who you meet with them and meet with your first choice first, and you come prepared, you should ask for everything at the get-go. The legislative process, if you're successful and your bill moves through the process, you are going to lose things from your bill. People are going to take things out. They're going to say, this costs too much. We can't do this year. It's not feasible. And so when you approach your legislative champion, put everything you want on the table and let the process take things out as you go along. Just make sure you know what you can take out and what you can't take out. You know, you don't want to lose, you know, there, and this is where community consulting with your community is really important, and your partners. Figure out, you know, your non-negotiables, the things that have to be in your legislation, otherwise it's meaningless to you, and the things that you can let go of. Figure that out from the beginning so that you're ready to negotiate. Sometimes the process can move really slowly, but sometimes it moves really quickly, and you won't have time to go back to the community and consult. So make sure you kind of know what it is that are deal breakers and what are things that you can let go of. And then the rest of this is, you know, prepare a one-pager, a fact sheet, so that the legislative staff can quickly understand the issues, you know, anticipate their questions, and then provide any available supporting research or surveys that support what you're asking for. Something that's really powerful is anything from their constituents, from their voters. Say, hey, 60% of your voters believe in this, 60% of your voters, you know, do this, or are from, you know, are refugee and immigrants themselves, or are related to someone. And, you know, there are organizations that do this research, like the American Immigration Council, formerly New American Economy. They provide statistics for every state in this country, and sometimes even your locality, in terms of, you know, profiling the immigrant and refugee communities, how much taxes they pay, how much money they make, you know, what their contributions are. So you should go and get all those materials and gather them to support whatever it is that you want to ask for in your community.
Yeah.
I don't know if Paula has more to add to that.
Yes. And just really quickly, again, like these processes could move fairly quickly. And so it's important to also have educational materials, right? These systems, sometimes they're meant to be confusing. They're meant to be heavy for community because, you know, someone who's working 80 hours a week, has kids, is worried about, you know, surviving, doesn't have time to go into the research deeply into what's going on with these systems and what's going on in like a process or a bill. And so it's our job to really make it accessible, make it, and I'm talking about accessibility with language, right? Are we making sure that it's language accessible to many people in the sense of, is it full of jargon, right? Is it full of jargon that, you know, like regular everyday folks don't have the time to really like fully read on and follow up on? Or is it something that is simple and that reflects their lived experiences, right? So people may not sometimes know like the full legal scope of things, but they're living it every single day, right? Like they're living the impact of some legislation or issues that they're facing, right? And so making it relatable is something that's incredibly important, and it comes from that consultation. So having that education, those educational materials in the languages also, right, that folks speak, right? Like, is it, are there communities in South Florida, for example, we have to have Spanish, English, and Creole, everything, right? Because majority of the populations that we serve are, you know, Haitian, Latinx, also like, you know, like refugee communities, right? Are we having it in the different languages that folks are speaking so that they could also participate and feel excited and also want to join in the movement? It's really important to have all of that thought out, because once it, like, you know, things start moving fast, as mentioned, it could be hard to go back to folks and like you know, oh, by the way, we're shifting the strategy here, right? You know, it's just important to have all of that considered to make sure that folks are being reached in the community.
We can move to the next slide.
All right, and yes, thank you. So understanding who are the players, right? Like as mentioned, like in the when you're trying to figure out who it is that you're targeting, right? To create your power map, right? And just again, power mapping is a tool. So to create a power map, you need to know where folks are gonna go, right? So the important people that are gonna support and move forward, you know, to move to their solution that you're trying to seek, right? Is the decision makers, right? Are there do you understand who the decision makers are? Does the community understand who the decision makers are? Who are the influencers that move these decision makers, right? And is there opposition? Are there folks that are going to be against this and, you know, could potentially block your strategy? Is your, you know, some of the decision makers may be the opposition, right? So kind of understanding the scope and like the field of it is very important. And so it's really important if you're, you know, targeting an elected, for example. Is the target up for re-election? Is the target influenced by media? What are the issues that matter to the target? Who does the target work for on a daily basis? Who does the target listen to and respect, right? Like when you're talking about targeting, you're thinking about that person and researching their lives, right? Researching their backgrounds to see what makes them move and what doesn't, right? Because when you strategize, you're not going to move, let's say, you know, this politician, this little guy you see right there, right? He may not be moved by media because, you know, he doesn't care about media. He built his campaign on saying how everything's fake news. So is the media going to be, you know, a piece that is going to actually impact him? Maybe not. So it's important to see because every target could be different and whatever moves them could be different. Important when we're talking about decision makers, right? Knowing your research of your targets, again, around their values and background. Like if someone has created, for example, I'll use the governor of Florida as an example. He created his narrative and his campaign being an anti-immigrant person, right? When saying how, you know, that's how he built his campaign and unfortunately won. So for us as an Immigrant Rights Coalition, going after him, like with that actually gives him good publicity because he wants that attention of being an anti-immigrant governor. So, you know, that strategy wouldn't work to try to shame him for being an anti-immigrant governor. And so that's how you know, you have to really know who it is that you're targeting and, you know, what you're trying to move them on. And I don't know if you want to add something else, Becky.
I'm good, thank you. Next slide.
So some of the tactics that, you know, we kind of, that you could use, right? When you are, you know, once you figure out your target, you've answered kind of the questions, what is it that you're trying with communication strategy, right? You have to use certain tactics to move everything along. So you build the narrative. So, you know, if you're trying to build a narrative that helps, for example, for community IDs, right? We had to share personal stories, like who was it that it was going to impact who would be impacted by community IDs, right? So sharing personal stories helps. Media engagement, op-eds, social media, those are different tactics that you can use in order to move your message forward. The idea is to get your message in every household, right? To care about this, because again, like we mentioned, not everyone's going to know exactly what's happening in, like, you know, legislative process or like, you know, what bills are moving forward or not. So disseminating that information through communication strategy and media really helps. Also asking, because sometimes we're in our bubbles, right? So what I care about, and I'm always, you know, I'm in movement spaces all day, what I talk about that for me seems obvious may not be obvious to someone that's outside of, like, you know, the movement bubble. So also knowing what is it that the general population is talking about, what is it that they care about. That's another way that you need to really, like, that's a way that we figure out what communication strategy and what type of narrative we're wanting to use. And I don't know if you want to cover this other part.
Sure. So a really important thing for politicians is demonstrating that you have broad support. You and your group of, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, whatever, how big your organizations are that care about this, can come and say, hey, you know, politician, we want you to support this bill or vote for it or what have you. They're going to ask you, who else is working on this? Who cares about this? You know, how many supporters do you have? If they get the feeling that, you know, you don't have a constituency behind you, they're not going to really pay attention. And so, you know, you need to demonstrate that. So, you know, not just your own coalition, but having letters of support from other organizations that are outside of your coalition, or, you know, labor unions, which have a lot of sway here in New York City, or, you know, high profile people, you know, people, organizations within their constituency who care about the issue. So just having that broad support and demonstrating it, getting letters of support, having, you know, other organizations, supporters reach out, you know, call the politician's office, send an email, you know, just showing that there's a broad support is really important. They're going to pay attention. If it's just, you know, a small tiny group, they're not really going to pay attention. They get bombarded daily with a lot of requests. They need to care and know why your piece of legislation is important. And I'm not talking here about, you know, this might be a little important when you want to first get maybe a sponsor, but after that stage, you're going to have to go and convince all the members of the committee. And then, you know, if the committee votes it out, depending on, you know, where you are, what type of government you're working in, usually if a committee votes it out, that's a very positive sign. Most likely, if it's a very, if there's one party that kind of controls the rest of the legislature, then, you know, there's a good chance that the bill might move after that. But, you know, you really have to work on members of the committee. Sometimes, you know, if you're at the state level, it might be heard by more than one committee. And then, you know, there's going to be a fight. Legislatures can't pass every single bill. There's also a limit on the budget and the purse strings. And so there's going to be various parts of the process where you're going to have to convince politicians that people care and they're watching you. And the other, you know, the other really important thing to remember is that there might be groups out there that don't necessarily support this. You want to talk to them before your bill ends up in the legislature, and you want to get them at least to neutral, especially if it's a stakeholder that cares about the issue. You don't want them to speak out against it. And so make sure you do that work, you know, before your bill is heard. Another thing that Paula kind of alluded to earlier is about translation. Don't feel like you have to take that burden on your own. A lot of governments will pay for translation at hearings. So when your bill is being heard by the committee, you can ask for translation for your supporters. Have them all show up, have it translated. In New York City, we've had hearings with like 4 or 5 languages translated so that everybody can understand what's going on and also testify in support of the bill in their own language. So, you know, that adds comfort, that allows your community to be involved, and you know, demand that. At least in New York, that should be provided. The state has, you know, a language access, a statewide language access policy, and the city also has that. And so, so it's really important to kind of investigate ways that give your community power in the language that they speak, and allow them to participate in the legislative process and make that accessible. COVID has also been great because everything's gone virtual. And so, you know, people don't have to leave their jobs and travel to these hearings anymore. This isn't true for all states. I wish it was, but for a lot of places, you know, it's possible now to allow your community to be empowered to speak. So those are just things that I wanted to kind of highlight. And it's very powerful to hear from the communities that are impacted on what their experience is. Extremely powerful. So we can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about the opposition. It's a lot easier to defeat legislation than it is to get it enacted. So this kind of plays, you know, when anti-immigrant legislation comes up, it's great for us that we can defeat it. Not always, but often we are able to defeat it. Now, conversely, when we want legislation passed, it's really important before, you know, the legislation is introduced that you figure out who's going to oppose your bill or oppose your legislation and talk to them before the bill is introduced. It might be a simple fix. You know, just show them your bill or show them, you know, the type of things that you want to ask for. And they might say, I like everything except, you know, I'm trying to think of like of an example, but I'm a you know, a real estate, let's say it's a real estate lobbyist, and they like your bill, but they're concerned that landlords are not going to get, you know, the right information or the right protection. Something very minor that you don't really care about. And you're like, well, okay, I can solve this problem. I can add something that, you know, there has to be information 6 months before this bill goes into effect that landlords are informed about XYZ, and they'll be like, great, I'm okay with this bill. And so it's really important to find out who else has power and will be a strong voice in opposing it and neutralizing that ahead of time. And it might mean including something in your bill, it might mean taking something out, but you don't want to have your bill introduced and then have all these different groups crawling out of the woodwork and saying, this is terrible, you can't do this. And then the bill dies and then you don't go anywhere. And then you have to wait, you know, till the next legislative session, or maybe for a few years before you can try again. So it's really important to kind of do that homework and neutralize the opposition. And there are going to be people that will always oppose it no matter what you do. Just be ready for them and show that, you know, you have more support than they do. I don't know if Paula, do you want to have anything to add, or should we move on to the next slide?
We can move on. Okay, I think the transitions got a little messed up. So Andres, I don't know if you can just show the whole thing. It's not working. So we have this power map, right? So we talked about a little bit about tools, right? So right now, with the power mapping, it's important. Sometimes visuals help, right? So for me, I wanted to share this tool with you all. It's gonna also be shared, you know, along with the presentation. You all can use it. But basically, this helps once you have all the questions that, you know, we mentioned answered, right? You know who the issue that you're focused on, you know the targets. This is a good tool to use to be able to figure out where power is and whether it's whether your target is movable and how movable they are. So I don't know if the slide's working. Okay, so here we have the four corners of it, right? So it shows that there's on the left top side is where they shows your decision makers. So the, what is it called? The vertical, right? Like the top bottom shows how much like where the people are, like, or where that decision making power is, right? So from the top is decision makers, all the way down to the bottom that it's like not in radar. So it helps you see, you know, where the power is in that area. And then on the horizontal part shows in favor to the left, right? So how much support you have. And then to the left side, it shows the against, which shows how strong your opposition is. So if you have, you know, let's say you have a target and in the research that you found, you put it in the map, whatever moves that target and is a decision maker of that target, you know, you put it at the top. So the left is strong support, the bottom left is weak support, right? So that way you could see something may move, you know, something may be in die-hard support in favor, but the target doesn't really care about it. So it's not really going to move them, even though, you know, it's in the support side. And something really important to note, I'm gonna show you all an example too, so it's not just this tool, but that way you could understand how it works. And then I don't know if you could, okay. So here, you could click it one more time. So if you see your clusters leaning up that way, right? So it shows that your you have a lot of decision makers that are also in support of it. It'll be if clusters like declining hill, you have the power to move the target. So there's a lot of folks that it's in the map when you're plugging your information in, it kind of clusters to the top right. That means that you have more of a chance to move your target. Now, if you fill it up and it's declining up, where you see that there's a lot filled on the top right, then it shows that there may not be enough power to move that target, right? And so the way that you move it, the way that, you know, you map it out of who's in support or who's opposed, it kind of shows if you're going to be able to move them or not. And in the middle is the neutral. So if there's a lot of, you know, areas that are neutral, that are, you know, not in favor, but not necessarily against, that gives you hope that you may be able to move them to the right side, or sorry, the left side. Is it the left side? Yeah, in favor, or even inclined towards more in favor, which I'm going to show an example of how we use this power map, and maybe it'll bring more clarity. But I don't know if folks have any questions really quick, just from like that quick example. I don't know if we could go back to it really quick, just in case folks have questions of the tool or how to use the tool. And I will be sharing this tool so folks can use also, you know, we use this, we made this in an Excel since, you know, the pandemic hit, and it made it, you know, accessible to use online, because usually these, you know, I like to draw them out in person in a butcher paper. But okay, so we're going to show examples of community IDs. So we can move to the next slide. So community IDs in Broward County. This was a campaign that was recently won. It's been a campaign that has been pushed forever by different organizations, different groups. It was originally led by you know, faith groups that brought it in from other states. And you know, there was always like obstacles that didn't move it forward. So we were part of the coalition in Broward County, which is a county in South Florida, that we were able to push through community IDs. And the way that we did it was by creating a clear analysis of the power that we had in Broward County, and also understanding that in the state, you know, it was the county that right now had the most power to be able to move something forward, that now, because it moved forward in Broward County, we're spreading it out in 7 other different counties. So yes, I will share with you the Broward contacts for sure. And so this is a campaign, and I can share really quickly our timeline just so that you have an idea. But this was a campaign that it took a very long time to actually build the power that we needed in order to move it forward. So if we can.
I'm pulling up the timeline right now.
Thank you so much, Andres. And just to talk a little bit about the campaign again, it was something that took a long time to move forward, because the field wasn't ready for it, right? So like, again, when we are strategizing and feeling out who our targets are, what's movable, what's not, sometimes it's not the time, right? Sometimes it is not the time where something can move forward. And so it may take time for the field to get, whether you get enough allies for you to be able to move something forward, or whether, you know, right, you know, in that moment, there's enough public support. You know, it sometimes depends on making sure you're building enough power to move something forward, and it sometimes takes time. So we identified a lawmaker to sponsor our legislation. We identified one of the commissioners that we worked together with Dan Rich, and also Commissioner Dale Holness, who are 2 commissioners, and we identified them as allies inside the actual you know, county to support, and they were decision makers, right? And so it was really important for us to be able to, like Balkis mentioned, we had to talk to them beforehand to bring forward, hey, we have this idea of community IDs. We think that the county would really benefit from them, and we think you all can be our champions. So once we identified the champions, they were like, yes, We are diehard supporters. Let's move it forward. After that move, we were able to identify an organization to sponsor the program. So we built our coalition, right? So we took the steps that we just mentioned. We built a coalition and partners that included the partners that were trying to move it for a long time, and that we pulled them in to show them, hey, our county right now has 2 champions where we could move this forward. And so we built that broader coalition that included service providers. It wasn't, it included directly impacted folks. And we realized that community IDs, something that wasn't moving it was the narrative, because yes, it impacted undocumented folks, but because immigration is so polarized in the state of Florida, we weren't able to move it forward in the past by just focusing on that. So then we started broadening also the scope of the narrative, that community IDs also help folks that have been houseless, folks that were veterans and that are now houseless. So it impacted a broader community, and it was a community ID that benefited anybody. I myself, could get a community ID and get benefits from, the library, or, if I didn't have an ID at the moment, it helped me to have some sort of identification. And so we brought in the narrative of it, and it actually brought in more support into our coalition. Broward agencies, we talked a little bit about agencies, right, that were really in support of this because they were part of the homeless trust, right, that they were like, yes, there's folks that can't get into shelters without a valid ID. This is impacting folks that lose documentation. So then they got added in. And through that, we were able to meet with all the commissioners and power map a little bit. And then, we went through the legislation process of passing it and securing it. But we're going to go a little bit into the actual power mapping of it with the tool that I showed you all. But this is kind of what we went through. So we went through the Broward Commission, we were able to pass the legislation. And afterwards, we went through a process of securing funding, and then, being able to launch the IDs in the different municipalities of Broward County. So that was a whole process but this was kind of like to show you how we kind of walked through the steps that we all mentioned. And I'm gonna show an example of the tool that I shared on how we used it to kind of power map our targets, which just to explain a little further, Broward County is a weak mayor county. And so our mayors actually rotate. They rotate because there's no election for mayors. It's kind of, just by name that they're mayors, but they don't necessarily have more power than, the other commissioners, as opposed to Miami-Dade County, which is an elected mayor, and they have more decision-making power. Andres, if you go on slide 20, I'm so sorry, I should have mentioned it. There's a link that has power mapping tools under. I apologize for that. Oh, let me give you access. Sorry, y'all. Okay. All right. Okay, I shared it with you. So sorry, I apologize for that. But yes, so with the community IDs, right? The beauty of the power mapping in general is that you can use it however it is that fits your strategy or campaign. You could use it for an issue where you can focus, for example, community IDs, right? Right here, we put that's what we want to move forward. So we moved who was in favor, who we felt was against. So here we had, I don't know if you could zoom in a little bit, but we had in favor many commissioners. After we met with them, we found out how much in support they were. And so we put them at the top for decision makers, and those who were super diehard in favor, which, as we mentioned, it was Commissioner Dale Holness, Senator Nan Rich, Commissioner Michael Udine. Again, names that unless you're in Broward County, you don't really need to know, but these were the folks that we saw were in favor, and based on their support, we moved them in the power map. Now, there are organizations that are not decision makers, but that they move the decision-making power. So it included one of the mayors, a chief of staff, faith groups were very for the community ID, interfaith communities. Broward Sheriff's Office was very, very supportive. And even though they weren't decision makers, we added them in the active role because they moved the commissioners who were the decision makers and created that support. Hispanic Unity, which was in some of our partner orgs, and also Legal Aid of Broward, there were some of the folks, right? Now we had some people that were against. So the county administrator, Bertha Henry, was kind of against it. So we had to put her there. She was inclined because she had concerns. And so we had to put her there. And then of course the anti-immigrant groups who are, significant because they pressure the commissioners, we had to put them there in the diehards. So this is how we build it around the community IDs to identify, the targets themselves. Now to zoom it in a little bit more, if you click target power map, Andres, we moved to Mayor Geller because again, it's not a strong mayor system, but he does, as the mayor, have a lot of clout. And so we there built based on, things to know. We figured out, their faith. He was of Jewish faith, right? And so there were organizations that really wanted the ID that were Jewish organizations. And so we had them on our side and, we were able to create pressure. The background that he was a lawyer. So we knew that he needed facts. We wouldn't be able to move him just on moral. Yes, I will share, Nejra. And so we knew that he wouldn't be moved on moral ground. It would be lawyer, to move on facts. And so we found all that information and we plugged it in. And as you can see, it was inclined towards the top right. And so we built enough power to move that target forward. And I will share this tool and also this example for you all, because I know we are running out of time, but just hope it's helpful for you all. And there's other tools as well that you can use when you're power mapping as well.
Thank you so much, Paola. That was super informative, and we certainly will send out the power tool map as well, power mapping tool as well. And I guess if Andres, if you can go to the next slide. I know we're almost at time. So thank you to both of our amazing speakers for all of this information. And I know this could be really overwhelming and a scary process, but I think if you have any questions or need support, we are definitely here for you. And if you are wanting to get more engaged and participate in more future leadership development trainings, definitely check out our website at weareallusa.org/OFA_table for more information on the OFA table and leadership development trainings. And I guess I'd like to open it up. I know we have 1 minute left to see if anyone has any questions. Feel free to raise your hand or put in the chat box. Okay, if there are no questions, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and wrap up for the evening. We will definitely share the slides and the tools with you all and follow up with a recorded session. Thank you all so much and have a good evening.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.